You know what surprisingly gets under a lot of people's skin? Be it if they're a child or an adult, being told what to do, or perhaps even more so, what they can't do. And I'm sure you can relate to this on at least some level. Maybe a teacher told you to stop picking your nose once, or your boss made you attend some pointless meeting. Or perhaps even in the worst of cases, someone told you to put down your phone while you're watching one of our videos. Blasphemous, I know. So, if that already makes your blood boil, as it should, hold on to your temper, because I'm about to hit you with a few more things that you cannot do. And I don't mean things that you shouldn't or probably won't do. More like things that are literally impossible. As today, we're going to take a look at a few ancient places that humans used to live, places that simply no longer exist. Not fair, right? Now, off the rip, you may be thinking of places like Pompeii, the Roman city that was wiped out by a volcanic eruption. But I'm not referring to any ancient cities. Instead, I'm talking about entire pieces of land which were once explored by our ancestors that have literally vanished from the face of the earth, along with all the wonders they held, many of which don't even exist anymore anywhere, including extinct prehistoric animals and lost cultures. And perhaps no ancient land better represents these two things than the giant realm of Doggerland. And yes, this is both an actual place and its real name. Today, the United Kingdom is known for being isolated from the rest of Europe, something which they really took to heart during Brexit. But once upon a time, they weren't so distant, and in fact were close neighbors, who were once connected to the rest of the continent through what is now known as Doggerland, a massive landmass that in its prime was even larger than certain countries like Switzerland or the Netherlands. And that's pretty massive for a now disappeared land, and also massive in terms of what was lost. Which also makes one wonder, how is something like this even discovered? And that's actually a pretty unusual story. Imagine yourself back in the late 19th century, and you're an English fisherman working out on a trawler along the Dogger Banks. Not the most flashy job, and probably one that got pretty harsh at times with chilly weather and lashing rain. But then one day, while you were out on your usual route, you start seeing some strange things among your normal catch, namely what seems to be a bunch of plant material specifically. The type you'd see from plants on land, not what you'd expect at the bottom of the seafloor. And while you may not be all that excited to be pulling up plants instead of fish, I will say congrats. Because you've just become one of the first people to find any evidence of Doggerland, and now, of course, a forgotten land. And this story is basically how it went down in real life, with a trawler revealing that plant matter existed in the depths of the North Sea, which was unlike anything you'd expect to find. And things soon got stranger as other items were recovered from the abyss. With a big find consisting of a lump of peat, which possessed a barbed antler point of phasis on the barbed part, because what this implies is that humans manipulated it. In other words, they discovered a man-made relic from the Ice Age, which was dated to between 6,000 and 12,000 years ago. And so all of this sparked the initial and perplexing idea that a real lost world resided at the bottom of the sea. This interest would grow until it reached a breaking point when, in the 1990s, a paleontologist created speculative maps of this land, which he dubbed Doggerland, a name that for better or worse has stuck since. And these maps provided just enough juice for a whole new wave of research on the supposed location of this region. With seismic surveys having played a huge role in revealing that Doggerland had truly existed, they even gave us some rough ideas of what it looked like geographically, which is not an easy accomplishment. But that being said, this part was still a lot easier than solving just about any other question regarding this lost region, including its origins. And while the exact details will likely always remain hazy, many agree that the region got its start roughly about 120,000 years ago, during the onset of the last glacial cycle, which was a cold spell during the Greater Ice Age, which for the record has lasted far longer than 125,000 years. But it is this cold spell that we usually imagine the Ice Age to have been like. You know, with all that ice, mammoths, and big stuff roaming around, and with the arrival of this last glacial cycle, the world's sea levels drastically dropped as ice extended further, and thus exposing Doggerland to the world. However, I will mention that its land has been exposed periodically prior as well. But the term Doggerland explicitly applies to the region as it was during this last glacial period. Now, given its higher latitude and the fact that, well, the Ice Age is raging on, it shouldn't come as a complete shock that you would have needed to pack a few jackets, warm mitts, and most likely some mammoth repellent just to visit. However, timing would be very important to determine your exact packing list, as this lost land experienced many different biomes over the ages, especially as the Ice Age warmed, leading to times of tundras, temperate grasslands, and forests, where rolling hills, valleys, wetlands, lagoons, and plains were plentiful. And these environments actually made Doggerland exceedingly fertile at different points. And we know that many walks of life ended up taking residence here, as fossils from literal lions, wolves, hyenas, mammoths, saber-toothed cats, bison, deer, aurochs, tive aurochs, and woolly rhinos have all been discovered by boats. And of course, from the title of this video, we humans are included in this list as well. Yet I'm using the term humans as a rather general term, as actually the oldest known people of Doggerland were not necessarily us, so to speak, but rather our cousins, the Neanderthals. As a skull fragment belonging to a young man was located in the Middle Deep some 16 kilometers, or 10 miles, off the coast of Zealand, which dated to 40,000 years ago. On top of this, various tools and weapons attributed to Neanderthals were found as well, including flint flakes and spearheads, suggesting that our close relatives once used Doggerland as hunting grounds and a place to gather resources. And you know how the old saying goes, sharing is caring. And eventually our kind, Homo sapiens, made their way over to Doggerland as well. And it is possible that commingling occurred between us and our Neanderthal cousins, but for now, it does seem rather doubtful, considering that the oldest skeleton from a Doggerland Homo sapiens is only about 13,000 years old. And not to mention the fact that most other finds attributed to our kind represent the Mesolithic period, which took place between 15,000 to 5,000 years ago. And in this age, Doggerland and the rest of the world had warmed up quite a bit, and melting ice had created endless coastlines, salt marshes, mud flats, and beaches, while inland areas were invaded by streams, rivers, lakes, and marshes, and in turn causing an explosion in life and leading some to consider Doggerland as Europe's most prosperous region for hunting, foraging, and waraging. And this hunch is reflected by the abundance of human tools found here, including stone ones like axes, hammers, and adzes, and over 2,000 barbed points, which is a lot of barbs. But sadly though, beyond these tools, not a whole lot of info exists on the ancient people of Doggerland. And what I can say is that certain studies do suggest they mainly belong to haplogroup I, and were hunter-gatherers. However, given the size of the area and its prosperity, there were ultimately many groups, including various cultures that were posted up here, possibly including populations belonging to the Maglemosian culture, who might have occupied the eastern plains, forests, and coasts of Doggerland. And most of these guys would have been nomadic, but some seem to have settled down in these lands as well, utilizing huts made out of bark. And in total, it's believed that Doggerland would have supported at least 10,000 individuals at any given time, whose entire lives and history surrounded this lost world, but which to them was simply home. And sadly, this home would eventually turn into a straight-up nightmare, as beginning roughly 12,000 to 11,000 years ago, the interglacial period started to come to a close, leading to a sharp rise in temperatures. And for a time, this actually created a relatively warm paradise in Doggerland. But eventually, the illusion was shattered as the ice continued to melt, leading to the land slowly beginning to vanish beneath the waves. Meanwhile, as the ice vanished, the great release of weight started to tilt Doggerland, and thus speeding up its destabilization. And over the next few thousand years, its inhabitants would start to notice more frequent and severe flooding, first along the coasts, but then eventually inland, forcing many to abandon their homeland entirely. And unfortunately, things would only get grimmer, especially 8,200 years ago, which might sound pretty specific, but was a very important and devastating time, as it was roughly then when Doggerland experienced the Storegga slide, also known as the Storegga tsunami, a giant submarine landslide which occurred after the partial collapse of a coastal shelf in the Norwegian Sea and sent waves as tall as 8-story buildings crashing into Doggerland and the surrounding areas, causing absolutely catastrophic damage to the coastal communities, who, mind you, likely had never even seen a tsunami beforehand. And the damage would have greatly varied by area, but just to get a feel for how bad it was, it's estimated that a quarter of Mesolithic Britain's humans were wiped out, And this event, in addition to the already rising waters, was enough to finally disconnect Britain from Europe once more and turn Doggerland more into a Dogger Island. And no one knows if any people remained on these last vestiges of the once expansive land, but I sure hope not. As the fate for these low-lying islands was the same as the rest of Doggerland, with waters finally taking down the very last shred of green about 7,000 years ago, a real-life Atlantis story. But funny enough, or perhaps depressingly enough, you'll find that such stories are rather common when it comes to lost lands in general. Just take a look at Sunken in Southeast Asia. Today, this region of Earth is littered with well over 10,000 warm tropical islands that are surrounded by blue, yet at one point they were surrounded by green. Like Doggerland, this area has fluctuated in sea levels, and therefore the amount of exposed land, and for quite a while at that, with its origins dating back to 2 million years ago. But newsflash, we weren't around so far back. That's honestly fine, as Sunderland wouldn't get all that interesting until the last glacial maximum, so about 26,000 years ago, wherein ice sheets were at their peak. And as a result of that, we also had peak Sunderland, a sprawling region which put even Doggerland to shame, having measured some 4 million square kilometers. In other words, bigger than India. And despite Sunderland being in its prime during the height of the Ice Age, do not expect a frozen wasteland, as it was situated along the equator, and likely would have been the place to be back in those days. With the temperature being about 3 to 4 degrees Celsius, or 5 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit lower than now, which is not exactly insignificant, but we're still talking about temperatures akin to present-day Ecuador. So, not chilly, no pun intended. And research also shows that it was quite moist too, with only temporary periods of drier conditions. It is worth mentioning, though, that you could actually still find some glaciers located inland at high enough altitudes, as they were more common than now, but still somewhat avoidable. And overall, Sunderland offered immense habitats to choose from, the most prominent being lowland rainforests and, drumroll please, savannas. Yeah, not exactly what you expect from this region based on its present looks, but at that time they were huge. And really, one of the only things that was the same was its good old volcanic activity, so that's nice, I guess. And all these factors made Sunderland quite lively throughout its entire history, especially when our kind eventually posted up here. And they might have done so early on, even before peak Sunderland, with a possible arrival date between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago. Now, they would not have known this, but these Og Sunderlanders weren't actually the first hominins to live in this ancient land. As in recent times, a Homo erectus skull was dredged up from a sunken region, confirming that, once upon a time, our close relatives lived here too, and also would have encountered another, older resident of Sunderland, the Stegomastodon, an extinct genus of gomphotheres that are very related to modern elephants. But with all this said, any sign of theirs, or the erectus presence, was likely already hidden by the time sapiens arrived, which is a darn shame. But sapiens did still see some lively things, literally, as Sunderland continued to teem with life. And this included an insane amount of turtles, crocodilians, pythons, hippopotami, rhinos, tigers, ovids, cervids, and proboscideans. And so, based off of a few of these animals, you already know that living here meant that life could sometimes be dicey. And this was especially true along the coasts where many humans actually ended up settling, as fossils showed that not only that sharks were beyond plentiful, but so were the now elusive Komodo dragons. So yeah, this region was no joke. But at the same time, these coasts did provide communities with an abundance of food and different resources. And recent studies on the seafloor also found that along with coasts, major river systems existed in Sunland as well, that acted as a hotspot for both human and animal activity for tens of thousands of years at that, over which Sunderlanders became adept fishers who utilized a myriad of coastal technology, including simple rafts. And in some ways, this land was truly a haven for humans, especially given the overall bitterness of the Ice Age. And it wasn't just those who lived there full-time who reaped the benefits, as researchers reckon that its human population would greatly fluctuate on an ongoing basis, with many groups apparently using Sunderland as a migration route. In fact, some even think that Austronesian languages as a whole originated somewhere in Sunderland before being dispersed through human movement. Though I will say that not everyone is on board with this idea. But whatever the case, the point still stands that Sunderland was vital to many, which makes it all the more tragic that it too would face a similar end to Doggerland. And for it, things started to go south or down not so long after the last glacial maximum. As beginning 18,000 years back, the water level started to rise permanently. But it was really in 3 distinct pulses in which the worst of flooding occurred. And as a result, coastal areas quickly started to be swallowed up, forcing many settlements to abandon their homelands and venture further and further inland. Eventually, a few thousand years later, the flooding had gotten so bad that Sunderland had now become completely splintered, and both people and wildlife found themselves marooned on islands, with the final result being the thousands upon thousands of islands that we know of today. And so this is obviously kind of unfortunate, but I guess at the same time, Sunderland does have a bit more of a happy ending than compared to Doggerland, as at least its legacy still continues to live on through these islands. Plus, while humans were forced to move and lost an important migratory route, their relocation further inland did lead to them adopting new environments, like forests, as well as more mountainous areas, which might have actually nudged them into developing farms and domesticating animals, and of course becoming the predecessors to the future humans of these lands. So, not all bad, though I do admit that having a giant, India-sized land to explore with crazy wildlife and savannas wouldn't be so bad either.